For several generations now, it's been a widely held view among serious students of philosophy that the greatest philosopher to have appeared in the West since the ancient Greeks is Immanuel Kant. Kant was born in the town of Königsberg in East Prussia in 1724 and died there at an age of almost 80 in the year 1804. Many jokes have been made about the fact that he rarely left Königsberg and never went outside his native province in the whole of his life. Also about the fact that he stuck so strictly to a daily routine that the inhabitants of Königsberg would literally set their watches by him as he walked past their windows. He never married, and outwardly his life was entirely uneventful. However, he was not at all the dry stick that my description so far would suggest. On the contrary, he was sociable and amusing, elegant in dress and witty in conversation, and his lectures at the University of Königsberg, where he was a professor for more than 30 years, were famous for their brilliance. Rather surprisingly, Kant was the first great philosopher of the modern era to be a university teacher. Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz, Locke, Berkeley, Hume, Rousseau, none of these were academics, nor were most of the major philosophers in the century after Kant, the 19th century. The obvious exception is Hegel, but Schopenhauer, Kierkegaard, Karl Marx, John Stuart Mill, Nietzsche, none of these were academic philosophers. It's only in the 20th century that nearly all important philosophers have been academics. Whether this professionalization of the subject is a good thing is very much a moot point. I suspect it's inevitable. However, to get back to the first of the great professors, the writings of Kant's youth and early middle age made him widely known, but all but a few of them are now virtually unread. His lasting fame rests on a series of publications which didn't begin till he was 57 and continued into his 70s. So we have the rare spectacle of a creative genius of the first order producing all his greatest work in late middle age and old age. His acknowledged masterpiece is The Critique of Pure Reason, which was published in 1781. It wasn't very well understood at first, so 2 years later he published a short exposition of its central argument as a separate book, usually referred to as the Prolegomena, and then brought out an extensively revised edition of the Critique of Pure Reason in 1787. There followed, in quick succession, his second great critique, the Critique of Practical Reason, in 1788, and then his third critique, the Critique of Judgment, in 1790. Meanwhile, he'd also published, in 1785, a little book called The Fundamental Principles of the Metaphysics of Ethics. In spite of its unseductive title, this book has had a simply immense influence on moral philosophy ever since. With me to discuss Kant's work is a well-known contemporary philosopher, Sir Geoffrey Warnock, principal of Hertford College, Oxford, and a former Vice-Chancellor of Oxford University. Sir Geoffrey, Kant was perhaps the most famous system builder in the contemporary era in philosophy, and one notorious difficulty about expounding any system where everything fits in with something else is where to break into it, how to make the start. Where do you think is the best point to break into Kant for an exposition of his philosophy?
There certainly is that problem. I mean, one of Kant's merits, in a way, was that he was very good at making an immense range of views fit together in a comprehensive and systematic way. But if we are embarking on the discussion, I think it is important not to start off in too technical a way. I mean, he's sometimes represented as conducting a sort of refereeing job between the merits and demerits of rationalism and empiricism, for example, or discussing how there can be synthetic necessary truths. But I think one ought to go rather further back to what the much wider and simpler concern was that really generated these other problems. And that, I would submit, was his concern with an apparent conflict between the findings of the physical sciences in his day and our fundamental ethical and religious convictions. He thought there was a prima facie conflict, inconsistency there.
Can you spell out what he thought the conflict consisted in?
I think the central and simplest form of the conflict was that it seemed to be a presupposition and indeed Kant thought a well-founded and proper presupposition of the physical sciences, that everything that happens is determined by antecedent happenings, and that there is always a law on the basis of which one can say that what happened was the only thing that could have happened.
In the physical world.
In the physical world,
universe,
yes. But, of course, when we're thinking about our own conduct, when we're thinking, say, about moral predicaments we may find ourselves in, we believe that we and everybody else have alternatives before us, and that there are various things we could do, and it's for that reason that we have to accept the responsibility for what we actually do. That was one thing, and he thought that that was prima facie contradicted by a presupposition of physical science.
In other words, how in a universe in which the motions of all matter are governed by Newtonian laws,
can there be free will?
Scientific laws, can there be free will?
Yes.
That was
yes.
Yes.
He was also concerned with the question how a god would fit in to an essentially mechanical and physically determined universe.
He wasn't the first philosopher, even the first major philosopher, to see these problems, was he?
No, certainly not. They'd been really quite a preoccupation of philosophers all through the 18th century. I mean, ever since the sort of great leap forward, so to speak, in the physical sciences at the end of the 17th century. Among the empiricists, for example, Berkeley had been preoccupied with this sort of problem, and among those in Kant's own tradition, conspicuously Leibniz. No, he certainly wasn't the first.
Why was he so deeply dissatisfied, as he obviously was, with what his predecessors had done about this problem?
Well, he thought, and I think correctly, that his predecessors had tried to somehow resolve this conflict or bring it to an end by downgrading the pretensions of the physical sciences. And that's certainly true of Berkeley, and I think it's true of Leibniz as well. And to somehow present them as inferior and not having a claim to be an equal contestant with metaphysical doctrine and argument. And for one thing, I think Kant thought that the record showed that that was not the right way to proceed, because on the one hand, the physical sciences seemed to proceed smoothly and progressively from triumph to triumph, with everybody agreeing what had been established and what hadn't. And on the other hand, philosophy looked to him like a sort of chaotic battlefield. No philosopher agreed with any other philosopher. No doctrine was accepted for more than a few years before somebody refuted it, and so on. That's one thing. But then he also thought, and I think this is more important, that Hume, in particular, had raised serious doubts about the credentials of philosophy as a sort of possible intellectual enterprise at all. And he thought that Hume's challenge, if one can call it that, had raised a serious doubt as to whether what the philosophers were professing to do was even in principle possible.